Okay, here's the deal. Washington, D.C. isn't a state because our federal system was designed that way in the Constitution, creating a neutral ground not subject to the authority or influence of any one state. So the real question isn't, should D.C. be a state? The answer to that is just no. The real question is, why was it designed this way in the first place? I'm Jake the Lawyer, and welcome back to Internet Esquire. Time and again, Americans seem to take the notion that we should just turn DC into a state because the people who live there have taxation without representation. While this is a cute moral argument that in the lowest possible IQ definition is technically true, in reality, it is a moron in a Halloween store Batman costume parading as the real thing. Justice. And yet the question of DC's statehood isn't some abstract what if. As recently as 2021, a bill to actually turn DC into a state passed through the House of Representatives, and with a sitting president who would have signed it, only didn't happen because it died in the Senate. So in this video, let's cover all the arguments, both legally and historically, and see just exactly why DC isn't a state and never should be. Our tale begins back in 1783 with an event that most people are unfamiliar with today, known as the Pennsylvania Mutiny. I'm not gonna lie, Pennsylvanians went kind of hard in the first few years of the Republic. I mean, you have the Pennsylvania Mutiny, and you also have the Whiskey Rebellion about 10 years later. I don't know what it is in the water up there. Anyway, it's 1783 and the Revolutionary War is all but over. Unfortunately, Congress has been unable to pay the Continental soldiers at the time, given the fact that they spent all of the money that they had or borrowed on the war, and there's generally just a weak national government to begin with. So as Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, the Continental soldiers who were stationed nearby sent a letter to the State House where Congress was, demanding back pay that they were owed. Unfortunately, Congress ignored the letter, and given their lack of resources and general ability to make no payment of any kind whatsoever, I can kind of see their position. However, angering soldiers who had just defeated the mighty British Empire turned out to be a bad idea, because on the morning of June 20th, 1783, a group of about 400 Continental soldiers mobbed the State House, demanding their payment, this time at gunpoint. In a panic, Congress asked the Pennsylvania government for protection by their state militia, and this request was promptly denied by their president, John Dickinson, who himself, funny enough, had been an officer in the militia during the Revolutionary War. So with an armed mob of soldiers at their door and no protection from the state in which they were meeting, Congress was forced to flee to Princeton, New Jersey, and establish a provisional government there for the next few months following the incident. And while fortunately nobody was injured or killed, overall the point had been made. Now this experience didn't just embarrass the government, it taught a valuable lesson. The seat of national power could not be subject to the mercy of any one particular state. So a few years later, when the framers were drafting the Constitution, they pulled out their notes of lessons learned, and sure enough, right there in front of them, they saw this. Dear James Madison, don't forget to give Congress the authority to create a federal district not subject to the influence of any one particular state. Your friends, the other founding fathers. Looks good. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution is that authority. Otherwise known as the Enclave Clause, it gives Congress the executive legislation to create an area that will become the federal seat of government. It reads as follows. Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be. In English, this is saying that Congress can carve out an area from the other states so long as the legislatures of those states agree, and within that new area, Congress will have complete authority. It also says the district cannot exceed 10 miles square, which in founder-era language actually means 10 miles on any particular side, meaning 100 square miles, not 10 square miles. Thankfully, this is one of those rare moments where the founders basically spell it out for us, and we have the additional advantage of a paper known as Federalist Paper 43, written by James Madison himself, father of the Constitution, explaining what he meant even further. Here's what that says. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here so that it actually makes sense in modern English. The indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, and without it, not only the public authority might be insulted with impunity, but a dependence on the state government might bring the allegation of awe or influence equally dishonorable to the federal government and to the members of the Union. What's funny about this today is that the people who argue the most for DC statehood are obviously huge fans of expanding the federal government, and yet here you have James Madison, literally the king of the Federalists, telling us don't put the national capital inside of any particular state. It can't get much more cleaner or clearer than this. You would think that between the Pennsylvania Mutiny and the Enclave Clause in Article 1 and Federalist Paper 43, the question about DC statehood wouldn't really be brought up, but yet here we are. You'd also think it wouldn't be confusing about which bathrooms people should use, but you know? Anyways, let's move on. Okay, so knowing all that, one of the first arguments that you often hear from DC statehood proponents is that DC had voting rights at one time or another. Again, this is like the Batman kid in the Halloween mask. Now, people either say this because they don't understand historically what happened, or just because they want to gloss over that and try to make a political point. Either way, here's what this really means. The Enclave Clause in the Constitution, yes, provided Congress with the authority to create a federal district, but the District of Columbia didn't just pop up overnight. In 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act to establish the seat of federal government along the Potomac River. The land previously belonged to the states of Virginia and Maryland, and as per the Constitution, those state legislatures had to cede the land over to the federal government, and this would become Washington, D.C. The new federal district was then organized, and Congress passed the Organic Act of 1801, placing the district directly under congressional authority. Now, before you go and spout off about the Organic Act of 1871 in the comments, talking about how America was turned from a corporation and it circumvented the real government and how there's the fringe flag in the courts and all of that, just slow down. We're not talking about that in this video, okay? That's a separate thing. That was a separate Organic Act. So let's just set that over there. Okay? And I don't want to hear any comments about organic acts or fringe flags or courthouses or the US as a corporation in the comments of this video. Of course, you're welcome to, and you know, if you're a sovereign citizen, you're probably going to do that anyways, but I'm just saying it's going to have no relevance to this video. All right, anyways, moving on. Sorry for the folks who don't know what I'm talking about. The Organic Act of 1801 was the actual moment where the people who were living in DC lost direct representation. Yes, that is true. However, people say that the citizens of DC had direct representation in Congress prior to the Organic Act. What they mean is that the citizens who were living in the area had been either Marylanders or Virginians, and they voted as Marylanders and Virginians during the time of this political transition. So was there a loss in direct representation? Yes, but it wasn't like Congress was out there stealing votes from people. This was simply Congress completing the intended design as per the Constitution, setting the federal government seat away from any state. So if anyone tells you that DC had representation, what they're actually saying is that, well, yes, Marylanders and Virginians had representation, as they still do today, but there was never some separate enclave where just people living in DC had representation. That never existed, and it never will, hopefully. Okay, this is the Make Citizenship Great Again portion of the video, where we actually get into the nitty-gritty details of who actually gets direct representation in federal Congress. Now, there's a lot of nuance, obviously, around citizenship and voting rights, and I'm going to do a separate video entirely on that in the future, but for the purposes of this video, here's what you need to know. The Constitution does not grant federal representation for every person living anywhere under US jurisdiction. Direct representation, as in you are voting for a member of the House of Representatives or a member of the Senate thanks to the 17th Amendment, is left only to US citizens who live in the states. There's like one exception to that, and if you're one of the 10 people who are watching this video from the American Samoa, you know what I'm talking about.
Good riddance, you filthy pile of pebbles!
Anyway, direct representation comes about in a few ways. First, in Article 1, Clause 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which states this: "The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states." And Article 1, Section 3 says this: The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Now, prior to the 17th Amendment, most people don't know this, the actual state legislatures of the states where the senators came from would actually vote for and choose the senators from that state. Anyway, that's the constitutional structure. Members of the House and members of the Senate are chosen from the states. So naturally, if you live somewhere that isn't a state, like a federal district, you don't automatically get the 2 senators plus representatives package. This is the way our federal system was designed, and it was designed this way deliberately. You also have to be a U.S. citizen because federal law says so. Specifically, 18 U.S. Code Section 611 makes it illegal for any alien to vote in any federal election. And 18 U.S. Code Section 1015 makes it a felony to falsely claim citizenship in order to vote in any federal election. Again, there are some tiny exceptions to this, but overall, that's the deal. I'm barking on a little bit about citizenship here because it becomes later when we discover that DC allows non-citizens to vote in their local elections. More on that in a minute. Anyway, if you want direct representation in Congress, you have to be a US citizen and you have to live in one of the states. It's that simple.
It isn't fair.
Yes. The old "that's unfair" argument. What are you, 5? That's the point of citizenship. It's something that has to be earned, sometimes over the course of a generation or more, as people come here from all over the world and competently and usefully assimilate into becoming Americans. Can you imagine showing up to literally any other country on earth and just walking into the seat of their national government and going, "I demand direct representation. You need to give it to me now." And somehow here in America, we're told that this is wrong or even racist. Well, guess what? We're not buying it. Anyway, citizenship is earned over time, and that's how you get direct representation in Congress. That's how it works. Next argument. You hear this one a lot. I'm a US citizen, I live in DC, and we pay more in federal taxes per capita than any other state in the country. And yet we don't have representation. That means no consent of the governed, Mr. Lawyer Man, who's all about natural rights and the social contract. Yeah, we should have representation. Yes. Well, like most things in law, nuance matters, and I have news for you. First of all, even if you were a state, how much you pay in taxes has no bearing whatsoever on how much representation you get. America isn't a stockholders meeting. You don't get more representation the more you pay. This is simply an irrational emotional argument where I could say, okay, only people who pay taxes should be able to vote as a legitimate comeback. Second, in this context, paying taxes and not having federal representation is not the grand injustice that you think it is. It's the exact same situation that every person who lives in Puerto Rico or Guam or the Virgin Islands also faces. They're US citizens, they could have representation if they chose to move to a state, but because they live in a territory, or in the case of DC, a federal district, that's not a state, and therefore they don't have federal representation. As an example, Puerto Ricans must pay federal payroll taxes to things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and yet they don't have direct representation in Congress. That's not me dunking on Puerto Rico.
Game. Blouses.
That's the constitutional framework. Statehood is the gateway to full representation. Now you might be saying right here, well, exactly, that's why DC should be a state. Hold on. DC also has one additional thing that no other federal district or territory has that they don't really like to bring up when you're talking about the whole DC statehood argument thing. A constitutional amendment. The 23rd Amendment, which specifically was ratified in 1960 and allows DC 3 electoral votes going directly towards the election of the US president. Well, the actual language says they get no more votes than the least populous state, so in this case they get 3, but still, having a federal district that's only 68 square miles have 3 electoral votes towards the President of the United States is a pretty significant compromise. DC also has its own House delegate. In 1970, Congress passed the DC Delegate Act, which, very aptly named, gives DC a direct representative in the House. The current representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton, is legally referred to as Congresswoman. She can introduce legislation, debate, sit on committees, and do pretty much all of the things that Congresspeople can do, except for make a final vote on the House floor. So when people say that DC has no direct representation, that's not strictly true, is it? And in fact, surprise, surprise, Eleanor Holmes Norton was the representative from the House who introduced the last DC statehood bill in 2021, which actually passed through the House of Representatives. Anyway, these two great compromises are super significant for a tiny area with such a large federally integrated voting bloc that they often go unmentioned when they're actually super important compromises that we've made already in the past. The next most common argument for DC statehood is that they have more people than Vermont and Wyoming. They love this argument. It's like their favorite one.
The new state has a larger population than two states.
Both Vermont and Wyoming have fewer people.
There's just one small, tiny little difference that separates DC from both Vermont and especially from Wyoming. DC is 68 square miles, which is well within the 100 square mile radius set by the Constitution, which means that if you live in DC, you can move 5 miles in any direction and either move into Virginia or Maryland and have direct representation. If you live in the middle of Vermont, or especially Wyoming, you're not going to move 5 miles in any direction and all of a sudden fundamentally change what your political status is. Look, moving to Maryland or Virginia is a perfectly viable option if direct representation does mean that much to you. And in fact, constitutionally, the existence of several nearby states only seems to underscore what DC was created to be in the first place. The next mind-boggling thing about the DC statehood movement is that they actually don't want to get rid of the federal district. Modern proposals merely suggest shrinking down the federal district to a capital core: the White House, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, and a few other federal buildings, including the National Mall. They're suggesting that we reduce the federal district core down to a space of 2 square miles rather than the current 68 square miles, and then make the rest of the area surrounding that now extremely tiny federal district its own state. So even the staunchest statehood advocates still admit that we need a federal district. Let's stop and think about this for a second. If the best version of the current plan is to still keep a federal district because we need it, then that concedes everything about why DC shouldn't be a state. Anyway, even if this were to happen, it still creates another problem. Say you carve DC as a 51st state out of the small federal core. Does that also automatically repeal the 23rd Amendment? No. No, it doesn't. To repeal the 23rd Amendment, you have to go about it in the same process that it was ratified. That's not going to happen at the same time that DC is created into a state, which would mean that you'd have this very awkward situation where now who lives in the federal core now? Because it's the White House, the Capitol building, the Supreme Court, the National Mall, and a few other federal buildings. So does the president now control the 3 electoral votes that are coming out of that district? And of course, DC proponents say, well, we'll just quickly repeal the 23rd Amendment upon passage of DC becoming a state. Unfortunately, they're lying to you, because yes, if there's one thing you can trust the federal government to do, it's to give back power that has already been granted to it, and especially to do so quickly.
Once all of Rome is yours, you'll just give it back to the people. Tell me why.
You know, I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of starting to think that they just want 2 additional seats in the Senate.
But the most important difference is that the district will have 2 senators.
Huh, look at that. Now, let's go back and talk about the incentive problem a little bit that nobody in favor of DC statehood wants to say out loud. Governments respond to incentives, and states pursue state interests. That's not immoral, that's exactly what their job is. State governments are supposed to represent their citizens and promote the prosperity and policy decisions that are in the best interests of their state. But the federal seat of government is supposed to be neutral, not in the sense that it doesn't have an opinion, but in the sense that it is not structurally dominated by any one state. And knowing what we know about the Pennsylvania Mutiny and about how governments respond to incentives, if you create a state out of DC, you create a state that is uniquely intertwined with the federal government in a way that no other state is. This inherently creates a set of incentives that no other state has. Here's what I mean. Most states can threaten DC politically, either with lobbying or policy or by suing the federal government. But a DC state could threaten Congress structurally by shaping the environment the federal government physically operates in. And you might say, so what? States already host federal buildings. I don't see what the problem is. Sure, but this is the point. In every other state, the federal government can spread out. It's not centrally located into a small core like it is in Washington, D.C. And that level of concentration is what makes leverage possible if the rest of D.C. were to become a state. The Capitol is not some random federal building somewhere in some other state, it's the nerve center of the entire system. So the conflict of interest is that a DC state would create a permanent structural entanglement of one particular state around the seat of national power, which would not only corrupt the purpose of the Enclave Clause, but it would also do the exact thing that Madison was warning us about in Federalist Paper 43. You don't need another Pennsylvania mutiny. All you need is leverage and incentive. And yes, modern statehood proposals do try to limit this risk by saying things like, well, the new state of DC wouldn't be able to tax any federal property. Sure and fair enough, but you're honestly going to look at this and say that limited rules on taxation are going to hold back the awe and influence that Madison was talking about?
She's a predator posing as a house pet. Stay away from that.
Two more big arguments. The first one is called retrocession. Retrocession is the idea that you don't actually create a 51st state, you just give DC back to the original states of Maryland and Virginia. In fact, this already happened with Virginia. In 1846, the entire Virginia side of DC was retroceded back to the state of Virginia, and now today, the actual current parts of DC are only those that were taken out of Maryland. So people like to reference this and say, hey, we could do that again. And you know what? Why not give DC back to Maryland? Well, there's a couple issues with that. First, Maryland would have to want it. You see, this isn't a one-sided decision. Their legislature and their political structure would have to agree to receive DC back into Maryland, something that is required by the Constitution and definitely not guaranteed by Maryland. Second, DC citizens would have to agree to become Marylanders, something that some would and some wouldn't. Third, you have to deal with the giant logistical and political mess that comes from absorbing a city into an entirely different state government. And lastly, you would probably still need a federal core, which concedes the point that there still needs to be a federal district, which we already have. Okay, final argument, the DC Home Rule. In 1973, the DC Home Rule Act granted DC residents the right to elect their own mayor, councils, and commissioners, and yet the DC local government would ultimately still be subject to the authority of Congress, as per the Constitution. Well, this did a lot to establish greater local autonomy. Proponents of DC statehood often still like to complain about this because what it actually means is that the DC local government exists only because Congress allows it to exist. So yes, DC has a local government, but Congress can ultimately override or even abolish that local government entirely. Now, if you're pro-statehood, you look at that and say, exactly, that's the problem. But if you're anti-statehood, you look at that and go, exactly, that's the point. Congress retaining ultimate authority is the designed constitutional intention. So knowing what DC Home Rule is, I'm gonna stop giving you legal arguments, and I'm just going to tell you about a certain set of facts. In 2022, DC's local government enacted the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act, which in English expanded voting eligibility to include non-citizens in local elections, specifically for things like the DC mayor. So let me put it to you this way. Congress is supposed to have the final say in all things DC, and as we know, it's a federal crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. And while DC local elections are certainly not federal elections, their ultimate governing body is US Congress. And yet US Congress, which passed the law making it a federal crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, cannot even get its own local government to play by the same rules. Now, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about DC, I don't know what will. Now, we could go on about the politics of this all day, and this video's already been kind of spicy already, but that's not really the point of this channel, and that's not where I'd like to end this video. At the end of the day, it's pretty simple. DC isn't a state because our federal system was designed that way, and that design is pretty intelligent and it works pretty well. And direct representation, if it was truly desired by somebody living in DC, could be acquired by moving a short distance in almost any direction. Now, is moving a burden? Yes, but it's a relatively small one compared to the grand scheme of things. And we can't look at this issue in any other way. Granting DC statehood in the name of fairness to its particular citizens would be injustice to all the rest of America. And that reality is just the balance that we have to make as a nation. And that's why in the law, we don't look at things in terms of fairness, we look at things in terms of justice. And while yes, this might be marginally unfair to the folks in DC who don't have direct representation, when we look at the entire set of circumstances and we balance that with the obvious negative of entangling one particular state with the federal seat of government, the balance as a whole is just. Especially when we realize the history and the fact that the federal system was designed this way. The Federal District of Columbia is exactly what it needs to be, just the way that it currently is. And again, proponents of DC statehood will often treat anyone who objects as anti-democratic, or even go as far as to make it a racial justice issue, which we know when they're getting to that point, there's not much left else to say. Other than we're a republic, we're not racist, and everybody realizes that the true reality behind DC statehood is to simply add 2 Senate seats, which are directly controlled by the federal government. So no, DC statehood, not our best idea. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've seen more than one, consider subscribing, or let me know in the comments below other video ideas you'd like to see me do in the future. It's a great way to interact and get ideas from everybody, so thank you for doing that. Also, I hope you're doing good, right? Say 3 things you're thankful for. All right, I'm out of here. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.